We'll do the first round of introductions as we're waiting for a few more people joining online. There's also some more people walking in. I'll have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for the day. First, I'll introduce myself. I won't be the speaker. I'll just be moderating. Hello, welcome. My name is Paulina Raniecka, and I am the communications coordinator at the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. And today, as mentioned, I will be moderating and introducing the speakers, which I'm going to get to right now. We have three speakers for today, David Rossati, Heidi Mendoza, and Oscar Widerberg. Best take at my Swedish pronunciation. I thought I really had it there. Okay, brief introduction. I'm going to start with David. David Rossati is an assistant professor of public international law in the Transnational Legal Studies Department of the VU Faculty of Law. He has expertise in international climate change law and international economic law, with general research interest in the issues raised by the linkages between the two regimes, particularly those of institutional or systematic nature. And David, maybe you could briefly mention what will you focus on today in your presentation? Just a little teaser.
Yes, on the new collective quantified goal and finance.
All right.
That has been reached at the COP and on carbon markets, decision on carbon markets.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to the second speaker. Heidi Mendoza is a PhD candidate from the Water and Climate Risk Group of the Institute for Environmental Studies, IVM, which is in the building next door, where she focuses on the past and future qualitative storylines of drought to flood events as part of the Perfect Storm project. Heidi, a little bit on your presentation, a little teaser.
Yeah, so I'm zooming in certain contexts in many countries and see how these types of contexts and governance systems are still made invisible in big negotiations like the COP.
Thank you. That's perfect. And Oscar Widerberg, I'm just going to go with this pronunciation, is Associate Professor in Environmental Policy and Politics. He serves as Deputy Department Head of the Environmental Policy Analysis section at the Institute for Environmental Studies at VU Faculty of Science, and his research focuses on complexity and hybridity in global governance for sustainability. And despite the content that was just shared here, I think we're having a slight moment of disconnect on the technical side. Despite the order that you saw here, we actually will be starting with Oscar's presentation, and Oscar will be telling about.
Yes, I will talk a bit about the general outcomes. Bit on why it wasn't as successful as it was. Look at leaders, spoilers, and maybe ask a few questions about the future of COPs, the future of the UNFCCC. I think this COP led to a lot of those question marks. Let's say, how do we move forward from now?
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we are indeed in a moment where a lot of people are raising questions and a lot of people are questioning whether there is efficiency in climate summits like the COP. So I think we're going to have quite an interesting set of presentations followed by a brief panel discussion. We have a few questions to our speakers on our side, and then we will open up to the public, also the public online. So without further ado, I will pass it on to ASI Director Philipp Pattberg for an official introduction. We're just in time with the online people joining.
Thanks, Paulina. Yeah, great to see you. So my name is Philipp Pattberg, and I serve as the director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. I'm actually also a professor of environmental politics, focused on climate. But today I've been convinced not to speak to you on the content, but just to give a short introduction. And of course, I will say a little bit about the content because I think it's really important. Maybe one disclaimer, the outcomes are disappointing. And so you look all very depressed. It's really nice to have you. Thanks for coming up. I think it's also important in these times that we remember that community matters. So I appreciate all of you coming here voluntarily to be depressed. So that's really nice. Let me say, before we get started, let me say that we live in a time not only of great global challenges, the environment, justice, war, and peace. We also apparently live in a time of a lot of international meetings. Because as we speak, there's just a new COP has started, maybe you know, one on desertification. That's happening in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. There was a major COP on biodiversity in, where was that? Colombia, in Cali. postponed. They didn't agree on much, so they will have to negotiate further. And actually, there was an international negotiation committee meeting in Busan in Korea on plastics. So all around the planet, people try to fix our problems with international negotiations. And as Oscar said, maybe that's really difficult. But on the other hand, we don't really have much other options because many of those problems are so collaborative that we need to collaborate at least a little bit. Some people say the COP on climate 29 has failed. I have looked at many COPs, so I would say, probably it has been actually pretty normal, and your expectations are just inflated. And let me say, there's always the next one. The next COP is actually in Brazil, COP 30, and a lot of the items have been deferred. And I personally think that's a great idea, because in Brazil, you have a much more proactive, pro-climate government that will probably try to have a legacy that we will reach an agreement next year. Now, I'm not sure if you agree with my optimism, but let's hear from our experts to go a bit deeper what really went down. And then, of course, also hear from you about your ideas and what you make of all of this. So without much further ado, welcome to this SDG Academy. And Oscar, I always call you Oscar Widerberg, so I don't know.
That's fine.
It's fine. So Oscar, please join me here. We have a mic here, and enlighten us a little bit on the bigger context. And as you said, maybe also the question, do we really need COPs? Some eminent scientists sent a letter. In that letter, they said, COP process, maybe not so good. And none of them was a political scientist. So maybe you can help us out.
Yeah.
Oscar, close yours. Looking forward.
Thanks. I never had. I mean, my last name is fine. It's not that difficult. But it's good when someone asks you. Right. So, hi everyone. Really great to see such a big crowd. Really exciting. Maybe it's because all the interest in the COPs and what came out, because there was a lot of media coverage. Because I think it was also for political scientists a very juicy COP. There was a lot of politics around. There was a lot of gossip. There was a lot of lobbying, interest groups. There was a lot of crisis moments. You know, delegations walked out of the negotiations. There were reports about fossil fuel industry coming in to kind of change text. So for someone who's interested in the politics around this, as well as of course the outcome, it was a very interesting couple of weeks, and also go forward to it. So I want to say a couple of things. So first of all, one of the interesting things with this COP is really, literally, no one is happy, right? Everyone is disappointed. So first of all, the big picture stuff, right? We have a goal on climate finance, which we're going to hear much more about, 300 billion per year, starting from 2035, which I think Nigeria and India, in their final closing statements, called an insult and a joke. So they kind of already set the standard there. So way too little. They asked for 1.3 trillion, I said, which maybe will come in the future. So the developing, or develop, as in UN lingua, the developing countries are not very happy. Then we did not reach a continuation on the global stocktake, which said that we should phase out fossil fuels, which was decided last year. Right, so we had language saying we should phase out fossil fuels. So we said, okay, this year we're going to just strengthen that, or at least say how we're going to do it. But the negotiators didn't even agree. Should we even do that? Right? Should we maybe backtrack on that? So, and this was something that developed countries, if we want to put it like that, EU, Canada, Japan, etc., said this is an important part for them. But that didn't reach the text, so they're not very happy. There is a small win. We got finally closure on Article 6. Article 6 is about the carbon markets. So we will hear a little bit more about that from David. But I think if you look at the ENB website, it's a great place for look for information here. They had wins. There was a cut to two things. I think one was this one, the Article 6, and then they had 7 points which were not decided yet. And it was all deferred to Brazil. So in general, a COP which no one is happy about. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is the case. So for me, there is this picture that's kind of already stuck to my mind, and that is the high-level segment on a couple of days in the first week of the world leaders that were in there and to actually come and talk to the COP. And the main question was not maybe who was there, but who was not there. So there's a picture of 80 world leaders who, said, well, I think we think this is important enough to come there. In the middle, you have Antonio Gutierrez. Next to him, you have, Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, who started the whole COP with saying, look, oil and gas is God's gift, right? That's how you start. So it was, from the day one, that was what he said. Next to him, we have Erdogan. On the far left, you see Orban, right? So that's like the front row. Keir Starmer stands there as a little bit of, one of the let's say, the EU persons who are actually there, but other ones are not there. Germany is not there. France is not there. The US is not there, right? Etc. 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 So we're seeing what everyone is talking about, this kind of new world order in one picture, which I find fascinating. So that comes to the role of leadership. And I think here you see the complexity of running something like the COP, right? So I heard at some point there were 40 meetings being held at the same time, 40 negotiations at the same time at the COP. So the COP feels like one big meeting. No, there's 40 of them going on at the same time on different issues. What does that require? Excellent process leadership, right? Does Azerbaijan have this? I think clearly we can say after 2 weeks, no, they not. It started with a full day of discussions on the agenda, and it ended with a full weekend where negotiators walked out, where in the end they didn't have even agreement on many different issues, right? So I think Azerbaijan really showed how you can mess up a negotiation. And something that really brings to my mind what happened in 2015, when France were known to be a very good diplomatic country, when they managed to get the Paris Agreement together, which was partly just based on process. And sometimes when we talk about these issues, we talk about politics, but sometimes just about the people who are behind it and are able to guide the process forward. Another thing which also, when you think about leadership, is interesting is China. So for me, one of the key issues and the key kind of news items that came out over the last 3 weeks is that China has surpassed the EU in the cumulative, let's say, impact on climate change, right? So it doesn't work. Could you still say then that China has, let's say, that we have a historical legacy towards China in terms of climate change, which is, under kind of really a founding principle of the UNFCCC. So China sends 1,000 delegates there, 1,000, people, so Chinese people come there to negotiate, showing them how important they think it is. They already say we contribute with $24.5 billion in climate aid. So there you go. So they're already considering themselves a climate aid group. And finally, they're trying to, I was thinking, how do you convince, for example, a Dutch voter, someone living in the Netherlands, that we should provide climate finance to China, right? Because that is what these discussions is all about, that the developed countries should provide climate finance to the developing countries. How do I explain to a voter here in the Netherlands that China, which is asking for money to deal with climate change, they're historically now a bigger contributor to climate change than Europe are? How do I explain to anyone here in this day and age, in this kind of current climate here, that they should spend money on China? So for me, China is such a good example of how this world is changing. Now, let me go to the second thing, and that is the role of spoilers. Following many of these discussions, that international negotiations that Philipp was talking about, Kali, plastics, UNFCCC, now in Riyadh, the UNCCD. One thing that we're seeing across the board is that most of them are not really living up to the expectations. And one country comes up time after time after time, and that is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia comes up as, and they've been doing this for years, for many, many years, right? They're an excellent spoiler in the negotiations, right? Holding back not only on climate change, but also on plastics, on biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are storylines where the Guardian came out with an article in the first week or second week, maybe, where that Saudi Arabia negotiator had been dealing, being able to go in and directly change text with the negotiating team or the secretariat of the Azerbaijanis, which is a big procedural problem, right? As Saudi Arabia is allowed to do this, right? The other thing is, of course, it's the lobbyists there. There are also, 1,700 fossil fuel company executives at the negotiations. This was even, less than in Dubai, But still, you see here, and this is also more news coming out that this has been happening over the last 30 years. The last one is interesting when it comes to spoilers, the US. So yes, Trump overshadowed, etc. But I'm thinking, where is Trump going to be in the future? Maybe they should leave the Paris Agreement. I remember in 2016 when they left the Paris Agreement, people said that's great because then they can't spoil, right? Because what if you would have, Saudi Arabia, the US, a couple more countries being part of these negotiations and delaying them further, right? So this is a bit why I'm thinking, what are the leaders and what are future leaders and what are future spoilers? I still think that China has an important role to play, but who are the ones that will basically pulling it back? One group is happy though. I did forget to say that, but it is of course the Arab countries, right? The countries that were trying to stop the negotiations, they have massively succeeded, right? A small group of countries able to kind of pull back on their ambitions. So it takes us a little bit to the future of the COPs. So I think it's interesting to say that, if you look at just the amount of stuff that they're trying to deal with in the COP, my feeling is that they're getting way too crowded. So I just went through some of the stuff, that they are dealing with in this 40 room. So climate change, of course, adaptation, mitigation, right? Just wrote down a couple of more. Trade, they discuss, in a separate room. Agriculture, food, gender, some gender work plan coming out now. Human rights, logging, oceans, ... These are all negotiated under the UNFCCC. So that it has become an increasingly and almost impossible process to follow. That's one thing I think is interesting. The other thing is institutions we know from international relations theory are often favoring the strong, right? The countries that are already, let's say, setting the rules, they are now, the ones that kind of change the design of institutions. And if we're now seeing the change of the COPs, let's say, which are the countries that are, let's say, now in the lead? Well, maybe this is the new world order that everyone is talking about, right? So that the COP is just a reflection of a changing new world order. So where does that take us? Well, lastly and finally, where I put my hope, and this is where people don't often spend time, that is all the stuff that is happening in the fringes. So I read at least there are 5 new coalitions being started around the COP, and this is high ambition countries, right? So countries, sometimes multi-stakeholder partnerships that come out and say, you go and have all your discussions, we'll have a negotiation, we'll try to make a global agreement or something, but we're going to take a smaller group and we're going to go much faster than the rest of you. So we have a coalition on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. The Netherlands is part of it, right? Beyond Oil and Gas Initiative, reducing methane from organic waste, and the Baku Climate Initiative for farmers, right? So smaller things happening in the, let's say, outskirts of the UNFCCC, and why I think the COP is still an important place, because it does gather 65,000 people per year to talk about climate change. Do I think that the COP is crucial? I do, but maybe not for the reasons that we normally think it is. So in the end, I do put my hope slightly elsewhere. I think it was a depressing COP. I think I share Philipp's idea. Maybe next year with Brazil in the lead will be a bit more positive coming out. But I think for this year, yeah, nothing else than a big failure. Thanks. Sorry for being a bit depressing. Maybe David will now say something very positive. Yeah?
I don't think so.
Start.
All right. So thanks for the invitation, Paulina. Thanks for the introduction, Oscar. So what I will do now, as an international climate lawyer, working and researching in the field, of climate finance, I will delve into that. So I will discuss what are the outcomes of COP29 with regards to climate finance, and also the outcomes with the other package that has been allegedly completed on the carbon markets, or otherwise called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So on climate finance, the news, the idea was maybe another statement about this COP is curb your enthusiasm kind of statement. But the hype behind this COP and also the hopes behind this COP is that a new collective quantified goal of climate finance would have been reached. And this has been reached. But what is this new collective quantified goal? Well, one has to first state what is climate finance. And in the history of the UNFCCC, so this international treaty and system of international law, there isn't really a specific definition of what climate finance is, but generally, if you ask anyone at the COP, they would say, okay, it is about finance that developed countries should give to developing country parties. So that's the idea. But for what purposes though? So the original idea is that climate finance should be for mitigation and adaptation. Yeah. So for activities in developing countries that, to simplify, reduce and avoid emissions, and activities that help the developing countries or their communities to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So this is quite accepted in the international realm. But I want to make 2 points then. In the treaties, there is no actual goal of climate finance. Yeah? So under international law, what binds states in what is stated there isn't an actual number or even a criterion to arrive at that number. What is there to are these COP decisions, right? Since 1994, this thing is going on and on and on. And what since 2010 the COP has arrived at was an idea that there should be a kind of threshold. Yeah. First, it was a ceiling of $100 billion a year in 2010. Then it grew and it became a floor of $100 billion. And now the idea was, okay, what is the new goal? And the COP decided, let's approve a new goal because we know that the needs are bigger, right? So as a lawyer, what I do, I read legal documents, and I read the decision. So what I'm sharing with you is actually that the decision is an admission of insufficiency, because there is a paragraph where the COP highlights the level of needs that are expressed in the nationally determined contributions of countries. So aggregated, the numbers that come out for mitigation, the lower estimate, is $1.1 trillion up to 2030, which means, again, the lower threshold, 455 US dollars billion dollars a year. For adaptation, the lowest threshold per year is $215 billion up to 2030. Yeah. So what has been decided instead, as it came out already, is a new collective quantified goal of 2 types. Yeah. So one is of 1.3 US dollars trillion. Yeah, 1.3 trillion US dollars. So way short than the aggregated amount of the needs. But this is not actually a commitment of states, but it's a call by the COP to all actors to chip in into this gigantic goal of finance mobilization. Because instead what the COP decided is a new floor of $300 billion a year until 2035. Yeah. And here the devil is a little bit in the details, right? Also with the issue of China, who are the contributors, right? So let's say in the traditional or the more accepted version of climate finance obligations is that it's something that developed country parties owe, under the treaty with the developing country parties. But here it is stated, also in line with the Paris Agreement, that developed country parties will take the lead to mobilize this amount of money, and instead that also non-developed country parties can also chip in voluntarily in it. So there has been a soft inclusion also of developing countries, so mostly I would imagine China, as new voluntary contributors within this new quantified goal. So this creates a differentiation that is not entirely new, but more specified, because now we have a number. Yeah. Then we can discuss maybe in the Q&A how this is accounted for, etc. But so the insufficiency is clear. So that hence the discontent. We know that this amount of money won't make up for the needs of developing countries, especially the most vulnerable ones. But something else that I think emerges and is crucial, I think, from the text of the decisions is that there is a bit of confusion of categories. And this, I don't know what is the reason for that. It might come from political reasons. It might come from the high complexity of the negotiations, which in a way lead a little bit into a not specified outcome. But what are the categories? Now, again, I want to stress my lawyerly take to this. Well, we have treaties. Yeah, if we look at the treaties, the collective obligation of developed states towards developing states on climate finance in the UNFCCC and the other treaties and the Paris Agreement concerns mitigation and adaptation. Yeah. But what is entering here, and also justly so perhaps, are new forms of finance. So there is an increased call for new type of money that should come from, let's say, the rich world to the vulnerable world, which is not really connected to mitigation, reducing emissions and adaptation, but to loss and damage. So the fact that the most vulnerable states are suffering loss and damage from disastrous climate events, and also just transition. So if we are going to phase out fossil fuels, also in developing economies and in fast emerging economies, who is going to pay the life changes that, for instance, the workforce that relies on the fossil fuel supply chain there will have to face, right? This is not mitigation finance, it's not adaptation. So a new emergent finance called just transition is also coming out, really important for the future. But in the negotiations, in the outcome, this really did not make up a category as such. And instead, what I can read in the decision is a tension. And this is an underlying tension that is always there in climate finance negotiation. And the tensions are between different readings of what this climate finance is about. So I propose 3 readings. Yeah? So the first one, as an international lawyer, I would say, no, climate finance is finance that is there to support the implementation by developing countries of the treaty. So the idea is that if you want all countries and developing countries to do stuff about climate change in a multilateral setting, you need to give them finance to comply with the obligations, because it's going to be difficult for them. So this is the idea of climate finance. But then there are other discourses and ideas and also elements in it. Another one, which comes mostly from the donors, so-called, is that this is development. So this is a type of development aid, right? But developing country parties would say, no, this is not development. This is money that you just owe us through the treaty. But the way in which this money is channeled to developing countries takes a lot of time, the shape of development. And development finance has certain dynamics that create power structures, also post-colonial nature. And another third way in which a lot of discourses come around this climate finance thing is the idea of reparation. So loss and damage again, but in the form of reparation. You're causing asset damage, as a lawyer would think, you're causing asset damage, you must pay for the damage, right? But this is not the original idea of climate finance. So I think the outcome is disappointing because you have the mentioning of loss and damage, of just transition, but in a hazy way in the decisions, while this might have been at least the opportunity to create clearer categories, yeah, to then decide how to manage this new collective quantified goal. So I close here on this goal of finance, and I go instead on the issue of carbon markets. very briefly, this is going to be really difficult for me to cover in how many minutes? 3, 2,
Well, be as
5,
fast as you
as fast as I can, obviously. Exactly. So there are two mechanisms of carbon markets in the Paris Agreement. One is called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And another one is called the Article 6.4 crediting mechanism. So where I'm going is, in the Paris Agreement, for years, parties have tried to negotiate a new, very complex systems of trying to quantify emission reductions and avoidance and removals from countries that can be quantified somehow and transferred to other countries or to other companies for claiming that they have been reducing emissions somewhere else. Yeah. So what this market is creating is both a system of carbon offsets with these two mechanisms, but also a system of claiming the achievement of these goals that countries give under the Paris Agreement. To keep it as short as possible, the outcome of this decision basically closes the circle, apparently, and says, okay, these are the measures that are needed to get this carbon market to work. But then, as a lawyer, when I read the rules and the decisions, what I notice is that the words have a lot of open texture, and these open up the space for countries and market actors to claim that certain mitigations, certain reduction of emissions have been happening somewhere, and that they're worth to be transferred, right, to claim another mitigation claim somewhere else. But instead, the claim itself, because the rules are quite open textured, might not be based on reality. Yeah? And especially under the Article 6.4 mechanism, now we have rules about removals, yeah? Especially forestry, yeah? Afforestation projects. So that should create these carbon offset credits that then other parties can claim, right? That as a means to reduce emissions and achieve goals. Well, again, there have been steps forward, but the language and the interpretation of these mechanisms on how to calculate the permanence of CO2 in the removals is still quite uncertain. So I conclude then with one reflection on these carbon market mechanisms. If I read the history of negotiations and the amount of words, these items, they win everything in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement and before, meaning that a lot of intellectual energy, yeah, a lot of negotiating energy and resources have been put there to come up with something that it's very likely to generate future contestations, yeah, about to what extent this is really a meaningful way to collectively really reduce emissions. So I finish my intervention here, but I really look forward for the discussion later also on the other items. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Philipp, Paulina, ASI, and everyone for being here. I have two disclaimers while we wait for my presentation. First disclaimer is that I'm not an expert on COP. I will not claim that because my work since 10 years ago has always been with local communities in the Philippines and in last 3 years in Peru. So I here today bring you local perspectives and how it actually happens at a very local scales. All these global negotiations, what they might look like or what have they been missing at a very local scale. And second, you might think that the presentation doesn't make sense. It's chaotic, but together towards the end, I hope we can make sense and how that all connects to the COP. So I'm trying to simulate here what happening in the COP where everyone maybe is all over the place trying to make sense. What are they talking about? What is she talking about? And then later, what are we all talking about? So, yeah.
Anyway, I don't have much time, so that's why I call this presentation snippets from the Philippines and from Peru. So I'm from the Philippines, and you can just, I think, yeah. And I'm a PhD candidate, sharing the same institute with Philipp, Paulina, and Oscar. So again, putting out the questions of futures for whom and by whom, because we're talking about COP because we want a better future for you, for me, for everyone else. But the question is futures for whom? Again, who gets to be there at COP, who are not there, who gets to negotiate, who gets to say, yes, I want this quantified goal, and who gets to say, no, I only want to give 3 billion to these developing countries. And that answers the questions of by whom. And I'll take you to some snippets. And then towards the end together, I hope we can challenge our current ways of futuring because my PhD is around futures of environment and human interactions. Should I just say next or? Okay. Yeah, you don't have to answer, but maybe throughout the presentation, we can think together. What is the shape of the future? And I keep asking myself this since yesterday while I was on the train from Berlin. What is the shape of the future? And together towards the end, maybe we can now come up with a shape. Yeah. Next, I'm sorry, I'm not used to say, yeah. And then, and so the work that we do in the Philippines, they add up to what we call the national NDCs. So I work with NGOs and other institutions in the Philippines that together we submit what in the end the Philippines would submit to all these global negotiations. And it's a messy process because you think that future is a place where everyone thinks about and where the future is a time when everyone wants the same thing. But that's not the case. If we all wanted the same thing, we wouldn't be here, you know? We wouldn't be doing other things. And to do this type of negotiation, to do this type of more inclusive negotiation next, we tried to not dismantle hierarchies because they're very much embedded in the system, but to transform or to create networks instead of hierarchies. So we work with the national government, regional, provincial, all the scales of the government, and until the local community. So what we wanted to do was really to bring the aspirations of certain communities into these national goals, national aspirations. And why is that important? And that's important because at the end of the day, people who need to reforest, people who are blamed because forests are decreasing in the Philippines since 1990s, the people who are blamed and at the same time who are asked to reforest, they are never included in negotiations. They're always told, you have to reforest. You cannot earn from forestry sector because if you earn from there, well, you know, our country cannot meet the goals. But these people depend on the forest. And so we have to meet that sweet spot of conservation, but also, as David was talking about, meeting a certain goal. But how do we do that when everyone wants a different type of future? So we were working with academia, civil society. This is what it looks like. And I can imagine at COP, it's going to explode maybe 10 times more, 20 times more, times 40. And the main question is who gets to say in each of that meeting, who I think the main question is who gets to say this is what we want. And are you speaking for whom? You're speaking for which country? You're speaking for which stakeholder? And my role in this part before was I was the one who can say yes. I can say yes, I want that. Yes, this is and I didn't like the power. That's why I left and now doing a PhD because it's a sticky feeling to say yes to things that I'm not sure what can happen after that. And the next, we also took up the negotiations at the national level. Here you will see national governments uh, who were not as kind, who some of them were kind, some of them were open, but it was a messy negotiation nonetheless. And we just wanted to really create vertical coordination because that was not in place before. So a lot of horizontal coordination were happening, local to local, regional to regional, province to province, but from national to local, that was not in place. So we wanted that to be in place. And I wonder how in COP that could take place when a lot of international negotiations are happening. But how do we trickle down the effects and the conversations at a local level? If in the country like mine, it's already difficult, I cannot imagine for other countries and contexts. And next, And yeah, so basically we were COPing ourselves. What do we want? More watersheds. We want to maintain the forest cover, and instead of the usual development of ecosystem valuation kind of planning, we wanted an ecosystem-based development planning where we really try to understand what happens in our forest systems and how human interactions with forest, with river, with all the other landscapes can affect, for example, water quantity and quality. So these types of questioning, but it took us years. The project is still ongoing. Um, so yeah, that's just a snippet. It's a project we did for 3 years when I was there, and now it's still being continued, funded by the Dutch Ministry, actually. This is funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, implemented in the Philippines by Forest Foundation. And next, yeah, and throughout the process, the main questions we asked ourselves for negotiation is that how do we facilitate people? How do you facilitate countries or representative of countries? Facilitating spaces, what type of spaces actually can open discussions rather than arguing? Because if everyone's just arguing, I don't think we can come up with an open future. And also facilitating process. COP has been going on for years, and I think it's high time to question ourselves, how do we then facilitate people, spaces, and processes so that we just don't end up saying, yeah, let's go to Brazil next year and maybe, we have better outcomes. We cannot keep pushing better outcomes next year, because what if that year we have different problems to talk about? And next, and very quick snippet as well. So this is my PhD, one of my case studies in the Peruvian Amazon. When I was working in the Philippines, everyone was talking about forest conservation in the Amazon. When I went there, asked about forest conservation, they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you're very important in the global. Like, I'm sorry, we don't know what's happening. And also, we don't know what the government wants to do with us. And so to do that, next, I did futuring exercises with some community members asking around the futures of forests, of foods, of the river, because that's very much important when we talk about global negotiations. At the end of the day, we want ecosystems that support communities, and not just communities working for a certain ecosystem for certain countries to benefit from this ecosystems. You want Peruvian ecosystems to benefit Peruvian communities, Philippine communities to benefit people there, but at the same time, how can that scale up globally? And so when we talk about just transitions, we cannot shy away from talking about the people who will be displaced by development projects, which some of the people I work with back home are actually displaced because we want certain development. So this is the nitty-gritty details that certain negotiations at COP take place, and that's how messy and ugly it can look like, but it never gets to the media. It never gets on the front page. It always tells you the nice things, but maybe this time they're a bit more open about uh, the disappointment. And here I just wanted to highlight again what came out from my fieldwork from Peru is almost has the same in the Philippines, that futures as a process. So COP is a common futuring process where all countries future together, sorry. But who gets to say again, who gets to organize, who gets to ask questions, who gets to say yes and no to what? And at the end of the day, which futures are we favoring and which people are we leaving out in certain futures? And futures as relationships, COP as a conference of party has not been really well in forging relationships. We've been so easy to point mistakes, point shortcomings, but how can we maybe just learn from each other? How can we maybe learn from good practices at the local scale and maybe scale that up? And maybe we can have better relationships than each other blaming my country, other country, and it gets messy. And yeah, I guess I will finish with questions because I'm finishing my PhD. I still don't have answer to anything. Next. Yeah, I guess maybe these are some questions we can talk about. Philip and everyone has mentioned this afternoon, it has been pretty disappointing, uh, pretty much chaotic on day one. But I ask myself, do I want to operate on hopeful rage or rage-filled hope? I don't know. Sometimes I'm hopefully raging. Sometimes I'm rage-filled hope. But I do think while COP is always or most of the time disappointing, these are spaces that are critical and we need them because at the local scale, yes, things are happening, but the problem is so much at the global, everyone's scale that these places and spaces have to work. And so some questions is how can COP be a process to reimagine futures together? And also the framing of the problem is part of the problem. So if we keep framing the problem as only climate and fossil fuel without talking about justice, without talking about equity, I don't think we're going to get to the future that we want. And who leads the negotiations and who are taken into consideration. And I'm not shying away from this as a scientist. We have so much to say about this. What do we need to quantify and what do we need to qualify? And as scientists, we're taught that it's always the lack of knowledge. And so that a next research is needed. So maybe we can take action, which brings me to the next question. At what scales are we addressing the issues and taking action? So with the new quantified NCQG, I was collective NCQG. What issues are we tackling? And is that the collective thing that can actually push people to work together? And when do we actually take action? We like to talk. It's easy to talk, but when do we actually take action, get our hands dirtier, really involve organizations, working together? And again, we keep talking about developing countries, developed countries, but do you know the faces? Do we know the faces of these vulnerable people who are still left behind? And I guess as a researcher, that has always been my my role in the meaning making process is to bring about different voices that we don't really talk about. So when you say developing countries and we need some 3 billion, if for what? If for what? And if you say you want to support us to implement what? And what do you want us to implement? Is that how it works? Or can we tell you this is what we implement? And how is that relationship gonna look like if the developing countries take more power? I don't know. I hope I could see that in my lifetime. And next, yeah, what is the shape of the future? Still don't have an answer to this. And again, who shapes the shape of the future? And looking forward to the discussions. And thank you again, ASI.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite you over to the round table. There's 3 glasses for you. Filled with water. Feel free. I'll be doing the standing. So for this section, we have a few questions prepared to lead the panel essentially before so the audience online. So first of all, thank you so much for 3 incredible interventions. I think we can all agree that we've learned a lot and you've painted 3 very well, 3 different pictures that contribute to a much wider, I think, comprehensive picture of how it actually goes at those large climate summits. And that it's actually very, very complicated and that there's so many different elements to consider. I wanted to start coming back to Oscar's presentation to build on what you said, the opening speech, very memorable from Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, describing oil and gas as a gift from God. And there's also a quote that has been resurfacing now. It has been also turned into new quotes as well. I'm taking the one from Einstein, who said you cannot solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. So with these 2 things in mind, should we all truly be part of the solution? So we're seeing that what happened last year with COP28, what happened this year, COP29, there's a lot of states that contribute to the climate future who actually actively contribute to the problem that is destroying this future. So Oscar, you also mentioned the spoiling processes, so to say, so countries that come in and actually spoil those kind of climate summits. So what's your take? I'm going to start with you. I've already made eye contact. How do you feel about this statement? Should we actually all be part of the solution?
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. And a lot of the people have been raising this, especially in this year and a couple of years before. So you have very few countries actually that are spoilers. Right, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Russia, it's a couple of more countries that have disproportionate amount of power to kind of spoil at a consensus-based process, right? Because it's consensus-based decision making. And one of the suggestions by this group of scientists, I think Philipp, you mentioned them, right? Which I think also included some old UN people, but very prominent people. They said maybe we need qualified majority voting in the UNFCCC. So what about if 75% vote for it, then we should have it like this, right? Great to bring this up. Let's see if the spoilers ever, say that let's reform it. The Security Council has, taken a long time before that's going to be reformed. So I don't really see that happening. What I do think is that we need a net zero goal, right? We need zero emissions, but fossil free. We need to be fossil free. Well, that takes everyone. That would be like we can't leave anyone behind. So it doesn't, we also have to, let's say, we can't have some countries continuing to emit CO2 emissions like the Western world of the developed countries have done for years. It also takes what's now called developing countries to also make that grand leap, and of course then we need to finance that, and that's the big, let's say, disappointment. I think that was never met. But fossil free is everyone. No one can be left behind, right? So everyone needs to be part of it, and that's you and me, and the city of Amsterdam, and the food, and province of North Holland, and the Netherlands, etc., 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 all to the global level. So everyone needs to chip in, because it doesn't matter where you emit a ton of carbon emissions. Everyone needs to be part of it. So I don't see any other option.
Thank you for this. I actually wanted to pass on to David because I saw some eyebrow movement as Oscar mentioned.
Well, you're holding your eyes.
No, not at all.
But there was some eyebrow action there.
Maybe on this short consensus, but no, I want to go to the question first. Also continuing on your narrative, Oscar. So I think the answer is very lawyerly. It depends. So should everyone be included? It depends on what you want from the process. So I think that the idea of having a multilateral platform for everyone, but here I say every state to chip in, makes sense, absolutely. And by the way, it's not that the COP has never, and the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement have not done anything. I think a lot has been done in these years. So there are certain things that the process does really well, and especially something that I think it does quite well, the UNFCCC, is coordinating the understanding of what's going on in many areas of actions. So communication, transparency, that's working on well. So in this process, you need everyone on board. Maybe also the disruptors, but then I also rely on what you are saying, Heidi, in a way, right? So the possibilities for the future also in international law and governance are infinite in a way, right? And I don't know. I think that at some point, because time is less and less, at some point it's okay also to lose trust on certain actors after that they are not demonstrating certain forms of, a lawyer would say, due diligence, about what should be done at this stage. So one can say a lot about words, but at some point one should also take a stance on what is actually being done. And to be straight to the point, so the participation of fossil fuel companies is highly problematic. Because we know that they are not doing at all what they are supposed to be doing to stay within the mitigation pathway of 1.5 degrees. And two quick points, and then I'll stop. But regarding to the COP, there is a big problem then with this heavy participation from the fossil fuel industry. And we had now two COPs, one after the other, right? They were, let's say, led by a certain ideology. And there have been discussions, and I think a range of possibility could be there to start also talk about conflict of interest rules. So I had students last year who did the research on that. So whether the COP should and could adopt conflict of interest rules for the presidency. And actually, there are cases outside, like the WHO, the World Health Organization, has very solid conflict of interest rules, also with companies from big pharma and etc. So there are safeguards that can be adopted. And finally, on consensus, so it's very interesting, right? The discussion about maybe we should go towards qualified majority so that more ambitious decisions can be taken. But something is happening at the COP as an international lawyer, because the decision on finance has been expressly objected by a group of states, and formally, this is objection could be objection to consensus, but the presidency, like in other cases under the COP, said no, this is not objection to consensus. We adopt the decision, and hence disappointment. But as an international lawyer, if I see that after the adoption of the treaty, there are certain, and this is a technical term, subsequent practices where consensus is different from other consensi in international governance, then we can start to say maybe a new rule for adopting decisions by climate consensus is coming up, which does not require the majority. And now, the almost unanimity, right? Objective negation of the decision. And so this can play in favor also for future ambitious COPs, right? So that the disruptors can maybe have less range of decision making. Yeah. So let's see.
Thank you for that. Actually, Heidi, I wanted to twitch the question a little bit, because you spoke a lot about imagining and reimagining. So I also wanted to ask you, do you think it's important to create alternative spaces to such large conferences of parties? Do you believe that would be a way forward to move away from one dominant paradigm? Do you think we have this kind of paradigm involved in global governance? That's something perhaps that you also saw in your work?
Yeah. I think definitely we need to reimagine new spaces of negotiating, of futuring, of talking about these types of things. And maybe two things. First is that in our work back home, what we saw was that informal spaces, which means spaces, negotiation spaces that do not necessarily have to be acknowledged by the government or doesn't have necessarily to be licensed, because as a group, we need certain licenses or approval before it becomes formal at a national level. These are very much important for different reasons, because not everyone can have the finance to apply for certain things. And I imagine that's the same at an international level. So this non-formal, informal negotiation groups are very much important to have inclusive spaces where different futures or reimagining can take place. And what we saw was that once this gets formalized, they fall into the shadow of hierarchy, where the government can say, yes, you can do your negotiations, you can do whatever, but you're under my shadow. So people can feel like things are happening because they're talking, they're being funded to plan. But at the end of the day, whatever they talk about, if you read certain laws or certain policies back home, it's still not there. But the government can always hide behind, but see, I gave you money to talk. It's just that it didn't make the paper. So I guess a lot of this informal and the shadow of hierarchy happens as well. And the question to alternative spaces being critical, I do think these are critical spaces. Otherwise, if we only look at COP and what's happening at the global, international, Western spaces, we leave a lot of important work that is already being done in different scales. Maybe it's not as important or as highlighted at the global scale, not as grand at the COP, but it helps at the local, regional, provincial scale. And for me, I think these types of solutions, these types of spaces where things can actually happen, because this for me seems COP seems like a long running negotiation. We also have to recognize those spaces, give them proper support, and maybe there are different ways to take care of the environment, different ways of relating. How that gets to a global or international, that's something I'm still thinking about, because then we need the right people who believe in these certain spaces. And not just a token or not just for show, because we've seen a lot of communities being there in there, oh yeah, they're there, but it's not genuine. It's a shadow of hierarchy again and again. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oscar, you also mentioned that there's a lot happening on the peripheries. Do you think that can actually stand up to this perhaps dominant paradigm, perhaps an ideology, to use the words that you also brought in, David, this fossil capitalism that we are perhaps stuck in? Do you think that could make a change?
Look, so yeah, I think what the Paris Agreement did was it basically said, look, every country can do a bit what they want.
Mhm.
Right? It said you write and you have to report that in an NDC, in a national determined contribution. That's you're going to write up your climate plan, right? In a sense, that creates a free for all. You can create whatever, bottom up, planning process as you want. And there are lots of great examples of that, right? So climate citizen climate assemblies, there are great examples of, involving communities where you can involve communities in writing the NDC, for instance. So that has, let's say, opened up a lot of spaces for experimentation, which I'm very, quite positive about, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is, yeah, we have the spoilers, but the cool thing is that there's a lot of countries who really see the benefits of doing things on climate change. One of the big discussions this year was on methane, right? So methane from food waste and from agriculture and from land use, right? From waste dumps is the biggest source of methane, except from flaring from gas, right? And there we have this coalition who's supposed to do something about it, and that's really much more action oriented. So when you get depressed about the kind of the global finance goal didn't turn out well, there are other spaces where a lot of innovation and pushing forward is happening. Whether that's enough right now, I don't know, but it's part of the theory of change of the Paris Agreement, right? That it's not one solution, that everyone can do as much as they want, and it's up to kind of us to help each other. That's why the finance problem is problematic, because it's supposed to kind of support everyone to do this, but it's not there yet. So yeah, but there I could get some energy from.
Yeah,
Right?
that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you for the positive note.
Yeah, no, there's lots of cool stuff happening as well. It's just
Yeah.
this maybe not.
Yeah.
Mhm.
David, before I pass on to you, I want to give a heads up that after David's answer, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Also online, I think there already is something online. Perfect. So David, any last thoughts on this matter?
Yeah. So no, I totally chip in with the idea of alternatives, especially from the bottom up, that work and how they can become meaningful for processes at the top level, at the supranational level, but staying there, right? You came with this question of the ideology of fossil fuel capital and the idea of the paralysis, right? That it creates.
That's one of the questions we probably won't have time for, but we can discuss it during Bodo.
Yeah, but it creates this form of paralysis, and so the idea is that maybe it's not really a paralysis that is being created, but this international regime, what creates is forms of, I would call, procrastination. So you know what you're supposed to do, but you're doing something else. It looks rational to you, but outside is completely, it's like, we don't have time for this, right? We are trying to define the national collective quantified goal, and we are unhappy about it. So in terms of alternatives, right? I'll spin an idea. Just it's not new, by the way, but I think it's also a valid one. These negotiations are very complex. The 40 negotiations taking at the same time. So maybe there are two pathways here for the procrastinating system. Either we increase the intensity. Maybe we need like a permanent COP, not something that meets once a year, because it's too complicated, and democratized, so that you have more genuine deliberative processes there. One way, or another way is to recognize that, okay, this is path dependence, this procrastination here, so you disengage. So strategic disengagement, especially for those at the losing end, might be something worth considering, but seriously, and then going towards more meaningful pathways, to pursue the interest.
Thank you so much for that. I will pass it on to Milica. Milica is our student assistant at ASI. And I would ask you to read out the question that we have in the chat.
Yes, so we have a question from Roberto Talenti, who's a PhD candidate in climate law. And what he says is that it seems that the real winners of COP29 are over 1,800 oil and gas lobbyists and 200 agri-food lobbyists. So his question is, it seems that climate change is rooted in a capitalist system that commodifies nature. As the UNFCCC emerges during the period of maximum triumph of neoliberalism, can we realistically expect these structures, dominated by states benefiting from exploiting nature, to drive the systemic changes needed for climate neutrality and alignment with planetary boundaries?
Well, for the next one.
Big question.
No.
Who takes the first stand? You won't.
Yeah, well, I can in case. So no, I generally well, it ties to maybe to what I was trying to say before. So no, it's a maladaptive system so far. That's my take. I mean, I guess we have enough hints about that. So something else legally, yeah, because the Roberta, she's also a climate lawyer. So I think legally there are also other ways to act from the outside, and one of them, it's for instance trying forms of litigation at the international level, from vulnerable countries towards other developed countries in order to pursue more meaningful climate liberation, for instance. But about system change, it's going to be a really difficult task, I'm afraid.
I can go next. I would also say no. That's a very big question. But I would put on the table like the role of scientists. As scientists, we're also trained in a capitalist system where we treat, well, some disciplines would treat environment as a resource to be, valued through financial matters. But I think we have a role to change that. We have a role to change that paradigm, ideology, and come up with new methods of assigning non-monetary values to nature. And I think science has a key role in that, because if we push for a different paradigm, different ideology, and different ways of knowing and relating to nature, maybe we cannot topple down capitalism, but at least there's a community or a space where people can then, oh, this is how we can do it. Because I think right now there's so many big challenges, but the question, how can we do things alternatively? How can we do things otherwise? And maybe that space is actually known for us, or maybe it's already known for certain communities, for example, but we still don't know much about that. So yeah, I said no, but as a researcher, I put that weight on my shoulder, maybe.
Yeah, so it's up to us.
You as well.
Should I as well? Oh, my, yeah. If I'd like to.
So if you feel like it's
Yeah, no, I think it was a great
yeah,
answer.
those are very good answers
Yeah,
indeed. So we're gonna open up. I see one question already. Yes.
Yeah, so you were talking about the hypothetical, like 75% agreement vote. Do you not then run the risk of these problem countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia just stepping out of the entire agreement?
Do you want to take it?
Unqualified majority. So I think what these discussions around reshaping the COPs has been going on for as long as the COPs has been around. So I think especially around, and that's maybe if you want to again found a source of hope. In 2009 in Copenhagen, the negotiations broke down. We had the old system, Kyoto Protocol, coming out of that, and people like, okay, it broke down. There's a new world order. China rose up and said, yeah. The BRICS countries said, look, we don't agree with the status as it is right now. And the developed countries said, look, we want everyone to chip in and pay along. So the world was different, right? And it all broke down. And then it took 6 years, and out came the Paris Agreement, which is fundamentally different than how it was before, right? So, where the COPs take us, I don't know any qualified, maybe, I mean, with a lawyer in the room, you have to watch where you're stepping. I know, I mean, beyond the European Union, I don't know any supranational bodies, maybe WTO, I'm not sure, which in the environmental field, which is where it says like where countries kind of subjugate themselves and says, yeah, it's fine, you know, we'll agree to 75% majority and we'll do whatever they want, right? Especially when some are so vested into the current system. I mean, something like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or any kind of, you know, any kind of oil producing country, Russia, right? Who would say, no, we're fine. Or even the other way around, right? So what if you get a COP which says, you know, we actually should increase emissions or whatever? It could go the other way around. It's, I mean, your question here, who shapes the future? What is the shape of the future? Some people are very happy with capitalism and want that to continue. Some people want other places, right? So sometimes I'm a bit curious about, you know, what would be that future? And I think that the COP is also, yeah, we need, it's going to be consensus. And people are flirting with things like, you know, alternative voting mechanisms, tinkering with the institution as if that's going to solve all the political problems. That I'm not sure it's going to work. It's a good question, right? So be wary when you read COP design ideas, right? If they're actually going to solve the problem.
See one more question.
Yeah, I was in the back, so I couldn't hear who was talking, so I'm sorry. I was wondering in relation to indigenous peoples, because I haven't heard the word indigenous peoples in your talk, so hopefully that will change, because I would say that 8% of world biodiversity is being protected by indigenous peoples. Also, all the critical raw materials, more than half of them are on indigenous land. So what would be the best place for indigenous to defend themselves at the COP30? So what would be the argument? Because obviously indigenous rights is international customary law. So what would be the other ways of strategy? So I'm talking here also to find out how can I defend myself as an indigenous when I'm going to Brazil.
I can go first.
Yeah.
Well, our work in the Philippines were with indigenous peoples. And as much as they wanted, and we wanted them, for example, to initially engage in negotiations and discussions, the first thing they told us, but we don't know how to.
Exactly.
And so we had 3 years of work first to actually talk about, for example, the customary rights and laws that actually protect them, because it's a very good law that protects our indigenous peoples. But if you don't know what protects you, you can go there and they can say things against you, and you don't have this shield or information and awareness of you're actually in the right to assert yourself. So in 3 years, for 3 years, you were talking about that capacitating them to participate, because then again, we're putting so much burden on indigenous peoples to conserve, yet without having to protect them, without having actually talking about, okay, we want them to conserve, we want them to cut less or consume less from the forest, but then what other sources of livelihood are we giving them? What other sources of finances are we giving them? And I'm not sure in other parts of the world, but in the Philippines, it stems from first really providing them that strength and confidence and sense of empowerment that I have this law protecting me. And then second is we have a lot of NGOs really working with them, different types, civil society, NGOs with lawyers as well. And they give them a sense of strength because we don't want to leave them there on their own. So the NGOs would go with them there. So I would say really first capacitating, or if they really don't know what protects them, first you really have
But I would say customary law is not really a defense because it's not obligated. And besides that, there's also this notion of someone also mentioned about reparations. So in the Critical Raw Material Act of Europe that just have been passed, it's stated that there will be a fair compensation, but who decides what is a fair compensation according to whom? And how can we include for indigenous peoples that customary law is not just enough? It is not enough.
Well, it's a very complicated matter from the point of view of indigenous communities. And my comment about the question about their participation at the international level to protect their own interests, at the COP especially, I focus on that. So I want to focus on that. So first of all, it's a bit sad in a way that as an international lawyer, that the only law that we have beyond the state is based on the concept of state consent and sovereignty. So it excludes, this this group of people from being able to really self-determine itself, right? And that the COP does not really provide meaningful avenues for direct negotiations, but these so-called side events, right? Is it so interesting that they can only participate to side events like other groups? So again, my goal is to think about reimagining alternative COPs where a proper deliberative process that is more inclusive in a permanent body could be a way to push forward, but that's more hazy out there in the future. Instead, from a legal standpoint, something interesting that is emerging is bypassing the whole thing. So legally, there are cases that are emerging of individuals, but they are actually acting in the name of a community, and sometimes indigenous community, directly suing the corporation. And there is a case that among international climate lawyers is gaining importance from a Peruvian farmer who has a farm close to a glacier that is disappearing due to global warming. And this farmer has sued a carbon major in Germany for damages. And, it is at the beginning, people were thinking this is, a meaningful case that will make the news and somehow raise the voice. But actually, the German court has taken the case to merits. So they're actually at the merit stage gathering evidence and see if under German tort law, let's say, this person will actually have a claim, a legal claim. So this might be a really important case that can spark a new meaningful way to defend yourself, yeah, as a community. Yeah, but very, very difficult matter.
Thank you so much, Oscar. I see you took some notes.
No?
Perhaps there's like a last.
Well, maybe there's more questions.
I think I see a few hands, and I'm really glad about that. We're in a very special situation where we are here physically. So officially, we will wrap up online, and we will mingle a little bit afterwards. And there's drinks as well at the living. So please hold on to the questions. I think most of us would like to hear them. So whoever's interested, let's stay a bit longer. I hope our speakers can also stay at least a little bit longer. Sure. So I'm going to thank you for now. Thank you for participating. Thank you, the audience online. And I will pass on to Philipp for some closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. I don't want to take the time from the speakers who could have said and enlightened us more, but I had three thoughts while I was sitting there at the fridge in the back. One is about the futuring, and I think it's important that we don't do that sufficiently. So we all say 2050, net zero, but how? Is that top down? You make me the boss or whatever, or is that bottom up? Really different future. So I think that's something that we haven't had a lot, not only at the COP space, but also I think domestically. Right? We talk about very technical stuff, reducing emissions, but how does that look like? And they're really vastly different ideas. And I think bringing this out is one important element. So the other thing I thought was when Oscar said there are these sort of obstructors, the bad guys. And I was reminded of this idea that someone's bad guy can also be someone's freedom fighter. And I was thinking about many African countries that say, you want to tell us to leave the fossil fuels in the ground? Of course we're with Russia, because they help us to get them out of the ground and do what you guys did. So we find it interesting coalition building, which is really against sort of the normative what's right, because it is right to keep them in the ground. It's really not fair, because what did we do with our fossil fuels in the Netherlands? Well, we used them all up so much that now the earth is crumbling, you can't live there anymore, and that's why we stopped. So I think this brings up a really interesting debate. Yeah, they are obstructing, but there are other interests that actually aid this obstruction. So it becomes quite messy and again political. And the last thing I was picking up was really this idea about finance. And I was thinking, capitalism was mentioned. I was thinking, I have really not understood this finance idea. And I studied economics, I failed my exam, so I became a political scientist. Maybe as an economist here, I can explain that. When you give $1.3 trillion in 2035, you need to first earn them. How? By burning fossil fuels, because that's how we earn the money. So isn't that really a counterintuitive argument? Because the money that we would give is money that we would raise by the same capitalism that actually creates a problem. So I'm thinking we're still really in an old model. You have a problem, we pay for it, which is the legal way. But how we actually make those things that we actually transfer is a really important question. And that's why we have to be mindful of that. And we have to sort of, innovate our way out of it, but not in a technical way, but indeed in a much more social way about how, for example, we negotiate, which is my last take-home message. If we can reform the COP, let's do that. And I was reminded by a colleague, Joeita Gupta, who won a big prize here in the Netherlands, the Spinoza Prize. And she has an essay competition. She wants to write a global constitution for the climate. And she's asking everyone for their great ideas. So maybe we can get some people here to write an essay and tell us how would we build a global constitution that would actually solve these problems. So if you're interested in that or anything our panelists said, join us at the drinks. Thanks for the Green Office to let us be here. And thanks to you all, also online, for joining us. I know we haven't saved the world, but we're a little step closer. Thanks a lot.